This is Tall Tale TV, your podcast for sci-fi and fantasy short stories. Of Bandits and Bad Magic by Lesley Herron. Chapter 11, Sambucus.
Just a bit further.
Atlas brushed the thick branches with his fingertips, willing his arm to somehow grow a few inches longer. Beneath him, Varen struggled to keep his footing. It was a difficult task to hold someone on your shoulders in the best circumstances, made all the more challenging by standing on the back of a food-foraging giant bear. Atlas slid an inch across the fur lining of the prince's cloak, and he felt himself begin to fall. He threw his arms out, windmilling them in an attempt to catch his balance.
Stop squirming, you two! I almost had it that time!
Eric shook his head at the absurd display. The mage had tried to convince him to be an extra rung in the human ladder, but he had outright refused, on the grounds that it was a stupid idea to begin with. A sentiment that Evan had agreed wholeheartedly with.
You're gonna break your neck!
The tiny merc wandered around the other side of the massive tree trunk, crossing his arms in a huff.
I told you! Just let me do it!
And I told you...
Atlas paused, shifting to place one foot on Varen's head. He leaned against the coarse tree for leverage and reached out with his hand once more, his fingers almost gaining purchase.
It was my idea, so I don't need your help.
Your idea?
Evan stomped his foot and pointed a finger at the mage.
Your big idea was to ask the prince, remember? I suggested climbing the tree.
Yes, but I added the bit about looking for the road while up there.
Atlas managed to get both feet on the prince's head, his fingers finally grabbing hold of the thick branch.
It was implied, you nincompoop!
Barry's sniffing finally paid off as he caught a faint waft of wild raspberries. He chuffed happily and began to amble upwind, letting his nose lead the way. Evan smirked as the human pyramid collapsed as its bottom layer lumbered off. The prince toppled and landed face first into the hard ground with a silent whimper. Atlas was left dangling from the branch some 20 feet off the ground, his legs kicking wildly as he struggled to pull himself up. Evan took a deep breath, realizing how much he missed having Vel around. It was hard being the only competent member of the group. He tossed his pack to the ground and stripped off his coat.
Tell you what.
He pushed up his sleeves and tightened the belt around his waist.
Whoever gets to the top first gets to say it was their idea. Fair?
Atlas swung back and forth, aiming his legs to wrap around a branch. He didn't fancy the idea of falling and let out a gasp of relief as his ankle caught the crook of a branch where it met the tree. Hauling himself up, he wrapped his arms around it like a life preserver and grinned down at the tiny dwarf.
Agreed, though seeing as I'm all the way up here and you're so short, I don't think it'll be much of a challenge.
Evan felt a muscle in his jaw tighten, but he smirked nonetheless.
You got that right.
Atlas's grin fell away as he watched the tiny dwarf charge at the trunk of the tree, leaping against it only to vault upwards. His tiny fingers easily found purchase in the rough bark, and within moments, he was already disappearing into the thick cover above.
Well, if I had known you were going to cheat...
Spurred on by his own ego, Atlas began scrabbling up the tree, shimmying his way towards the next branch. He glanced back down at the prince below, nursing his bruised face.
Oi! Don't go anywhere. I'll need you to catch me if I fall.
Varen got to his feet and nodded, holding out his hands to show he was ready. Eric shook his head and began to walk away. He couldn't watch this. Perhaps it was because the mage and the tiny merc had spent the last several hours arguing, or maybe it was that he was fairly certain he had brushed up against something akin to poison oak earlier, but he was in a foul mood. Deciding against getting kidnapped or lost again, he moved only a short distance away from the others and tossed his pack against the trunk of a smaller tree. He let out a huff and slumped down beside it. For the first time, in what felt like a while, he fished his journal out of the bag and flipped through the pages. Losing himself in his work always helped to calm him down. But not this time. Many of his carefully scrawled notes were defaced with graffiti, courtesy of that self-proclaimed arcanist. He pushed down his anger and flipped to the first blank page, staring at it for a while. Well, this was new. He couldn't think of anything to write. His mind kept wandering back to Vel. It wasn't like his brother to be gone this long. He was just too stubborn to stay away. Hell, he had even been too stubborn to die properly, let alone go this long without berating Eric for one thing or another. If he knew they were on their way to find a magic spell to locate him, he'd never let them hear the end of it. Eric wanted so desperately to leave this place, but he couldn't just abandon his brother here. Not that he even could. He set down his notebook and reached into his pack again, pulling out the remnants of his portal device. He sighed as he turned it over in his hands. Even if the charged shell had protected the delicate internal components, he was missing more than half of it. It was beyond repair. Meaning they would have to find another way off this realm. Eric tossed the melted hunk of metal back into his bag. With a bitter roll of his eyes, he considered asking Atlas if it was possible to use magic to open a portal back home. Magic. That's what they called everything back where he was from. Anything people couldn't explain boiled down to one uneducated response. His father had been a scientist, and thankfully taught him that the unexplained is simply a lack of understanding, not the impossible. Eric picked up his journal again and began scribbling down all the things he had seen that the locals were so quick to attribute to as magic. He licked his lips as he wrote down each event, followed by his educated guess as to the scientific explanation, even if it was a bit of a stretch. Parasitic fungi, gunpowder, stage magic, abuse of naturally occurring weather events. Each one was more impossible than the last, but he rationalized them either way. His pen stopped at the giant plant. Try as he might, there was only one explanation he could come up with. Magic. He refused to believe. He would never believe. His father's voice rose in the back of his mind. If the data runs counter to your current understanding, you don't ignore the information. You change your understanding. Eric hissed a breath through his clenched teeth. You can't just shut your eyes and cover your ears when met with something that doesn't fit your neat little model of the world. He sighed and leaned his head back. Thanks, Dad. But would you still say that if you saw this place? He knew in his heart he was being a poor excuse for a scientist. Regardless if it was magic or not, everything could be explained. Even something as bizarre as this had to operate by rules. And science, after all, was just understanding the laws that governed reality. Perhaps if he stopped resisting and started analyzing, he could bridge that gap from magic back to science. Eric started scanning his surroundings for anything magical. After all, even some of the damn trees were sentient in this place. His first pass yielded nothing. Trees, rocks, brush, all mundane objects. But then he spotted a scattering of large-leafed plants with bright red fronds and small orange flowers. He couldn't be sure what it was that drew his attention, but one of them caught his eye. With a start, he realized it was casting multiple sets of shadows, ones that were moving out of sync with the leaves. Eric sketched the plant out in his journal, taking note of how it swayed despite the lack of wind. Perhaps it was home to a burrowing mammal or a roost of tiny birds. but that didn't explain the extra shadows. He got to his feet and moved next to the plant, kneeling down for a closer look. Inside was too dark to see anything, like the shadows had somehow grown thicker. A small, vibrant pink insect buzzed by him and landed on one of the large leaves. It scurried around in a circle, rubbing its massive back legs together. Shadows coalesced from within and began to pool up the valley of the leaf, causing it to dip. Before the bug could react, the darkness lifted away from the plant, forming a small, three-dimensional hand that snatched the bug off the leaf and pulled it down into the dark center of the plant. Eric felt a rush of fear and the tingle of excitement. He detailed his observations next to the drawing of the plant, the way the shadows moved, the hand, the bug, everything. He leaned a little closer and watched as the leaves vibrated, rustling with a faint whisper. He reached over, plucking up a broken twig, and slowly pushed it into the center of the plant. Nothing happened. The stick sank silently into the quivering mass without resistance. He pulled it back out and examined it. The twig was undamaged. He needed something else to prod at the darkness. The twig failed to spur a reaction, so perhaps food would have the result he was looking for. Glancing around, his eyes landed on a small mushroom growing in the shade of the tree his bag was perched against. He tugged it from the ground and tossed it into the bush. Eric let out a chuckle as the entire thing was lobbed right back out. "Must be carnivorous," he thought. He scoured the ground and collected several small bugs without difficulty. He flicked them at the plant one at a time and was delighted as the tiny hands shot up to capture them each time. He scribbled more words into his journal, pausing long enough to illustrate the tiny creatures. As the creatures ate, he could see them peering out from between the giant leaves of the plant. There were 4 or 5 sets of gleaming white eyes that stared at him hungrily as they consumed each offering with greedy intent. Eric tapped at his chin, lost in a moment of thought. They appeared to be ambush predators, and therefore hard to draw out of their cover. Perhaps something larger would cause them to work together, allowing him a better look at their physiology. He got up, shoved his book back into his pack, and looked around. He managed, with reluctance, to capture a beetle the size of his fist that was crawling slowly across a rotten log. With a hurried apology, he tossed it towards the rustling bush, just out of reach. The bug landed on its back. It struggled there for a moment before righting itself. Eric watched as the tiny eyes, nestled within the plant, tracked its every movement. He could almost see their hungry mouths willing it to move closer. But instead, the bug began to crawl away. The shadowy creatures reacted, spilling out onto the ground near the insect. Eric's eyes widened as he realized they were vaguely humanoid, several inches tall, with hunched bodies and long, thin arms. They worked together, digging their sharp fingers into the dirt where the insect cast a shadow. Like a fly caught in a web, the stink bug struggled to get away, its tiny legs digging into the soft earth. Eric frowned. The insect was behaving like it had been restrained, but nothing was visibly holding it in place. It wasn't until the little creatures began taking bites out of the bug's shadow, leaving gaps of light where it had just been dark a moment before, that he realized what was happening. They had ensnared it by holding on to its shadow. Eric pinched the bridge of his nose and swore under his breath.
Physics doesn't work that way.
Ready to give up his experiment and chalk the whole thing up to a hallucination, he looked over to see the shadow sprites had released the insect and retreated back to their plant. The bug ambled away towards the tree line, where it was bathed in the warm glow of the afternoon sun. But it was no longer casting a shadow. Eric frowned, but reached for his journal to jot down these observations. He had barely put pen to paper when the bug made one jarring movement before keeling over entirely. Its legs curled in on itself, and it stopped moving. He looked back over at the terrifying eyes staring out at him. Fascinating. There was a loud crack of a breaking branch from somewhere above, followed by a far-off shout, "Ah, hell!" The creature scattered from the plant as the snapping of several branches cracked like a whip through the forest. Eric looked over his shoulder in time to see Atlas falling through the tree, colliding with several more branches on the way down, and crunch into the ground right behind him. Herron rushed over, his arms still outstretched, but they slowly fell to his sides as he realized he was too late to catch the Arcanist. There was a long pause before Atlas moved. He whimpered as he pulled himself to his feet with the prince's help. He pushed his hands into the small of his back, causing his spine to give an audible snap. He glowered at the mute. Then over to his friend, whose lips and snout were still stained red from his foraging. He jammed a finger at Herron.
"I told you to be ready to catch me."
He turned and jabbed it at the bear.
"Now stop eating so I can tell you what I saw."
Hey, no fair!
Evan's voice echoed from somewhere in the treetops.
I saw it first, so I get to tell him.
"You didn't see anything, on the count of you're so short."
Atlas grinned.
"I saw a campfire."
You son of a... Just wait till I get down there.
At the sound of the rustling of leaves, indicating the tiny dwarf was quickly starting his descent, Atlas spun on his heel and started marching into the forest.
This way."
Eric rolled his eyes as they walked away, and instead returned his attention back to the plant. It was empty and silent, the inhabitants scared off by the idiot mage. He scanned the area, hoping to find them again. One small, tiny humanoid shadow was standing not 3 feet from him, staring up with bright, inquisitive yellow eyes. Eric knelt down, but didn't approach. Now that it was out in the open by itself, he could see far more detail. The sprite had to only be about 6 or 7 inches tall, was a dark gray in color, and had a tuft of white hair on its head. Eric leaned in, careful to move slowly so as not to scare it.
"Hey there, little guy."
The sprite blinked several times, and then looked down at the giant shadow, tantalizingly close. It bent and sunk its sharp fingers into the ground, holding the darkness in place. Eric jolted and fell back on his rump. He didn't feel any pain, but his eyes went wide when he saw that his shadow had not fully followed him. It was stretched, locked in place by the sprite.
"What the—"
The little creature seemed to melt into the earth, its body pooling into a 2-dimensional shadow of itself, claws still holding him in place.
"Oh, that can't be good."
Eric clambered to his feet, watching his shadow lengthen and twist as he stumbled out into the sunlight. The image of the sprite opened its mouth, revealing sharp, jagged teeth, before it chomped down on the shadow of his head. Eric flung his hands up, swiping them through his hair like he was trying to dislodge a spider. Heart-pounding, he watched as the creature caught hold of his arm next, tearing a massive chunk out of it.
"Oh, crap!"
Eric tried stomping on the 2-dimensional creature, but it simply tore apart the shadow of his leg. In a moment of sheer, mindless panic, Eric let out a high-pitched scream. He threw his arms over his face and dropped to the ground, curling up into a ball. This was how he was going to die, eaten alive on a foreign world by a living shadow. There was a thump as something landed beside him.
Dude, you okay?
Eric peeked out from beneath his arms to see the tiny merc, and squeaked,
"It's eating my shadow!"
Evan raised a concerned eyebrow.
Say what?
Eric jabbed a finger at the ground.
"My shadow! It ate my shadow! And now I'm going to die!"
Evan scratched at the back of his head, more than a little confused, before gesturing to the ground.
You mean that shadow?
Perplexed, Eric sat up. He looked down to see, sure enough, his shadow was there. He waved his hand and felt a rush of relief wash over him as his shadow mirrored the action. He did the same with his other arm and sighed when it too was repeated.
Huh.
You okay, man? When's the last time you had some water?
Eric slowly stood up, lifting one leg, then the other, watching just to make sure.
Yesterday?
Evan gave him a concerned look.
Seriously, bro? Come on, I got a canteen in my gear.
He motioned towards their small camp.
Also, we have to go save Bob. He got tangled up in the nettles, attempting to climb the tree with us.
Eric nodded and gathered his gear, slowly following the tiny merc. Dehydration. Of course! He looked behind him, and for a split second, could have sworn his shadow blinked up at him with a pair of bright yellow eyes.
Yeah. Water first, okay?
Of Bandits and Bad Magic is Book 3 of the ongoing series by Lesley Herron. Tune in every few weeks to hear the latest chapter as it's being written. If you'd like to listen to Books 1 and 2, you can find links in the description.
Wow. He's really stuck in there, isn't he?
Yeah, he got about 5 feet up before falling backwards on top of all that.
It looks like in the movies, like when a bad guy falls into a pit with spikes at the bottom.
Yeah, or like those cheesy kung fu movies where someone gets stabbed by a couple dozen spears.
Oh, yeah. I still don't get why I had to be the one to wade in here and tie a rope around him.
Because you cheated. And I know where you sleep.
Whatever. The rope's in place.
Okay, Barry, you're up. Pull him on out of here.
Oh, gods! It's everywhere! Wow. Did not see that coming.
Cut him right in half. Nasty.
Oh, I got some in my mouth.
That's what you get for cheating.